Paula Drogi, and this is my search for a material soul. Psalm 139 reads, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well." This quote is often used by pro-life Christians as proof that God is against abortion. I've never understood how this is supposed to work. Of course, God knows us as fetus or sperm and egg, or even as the DNA permutations of all the possible combinations of alleles that I might have inherited from my parents. God is omniscient, which doesn't mean only knowing all of what turns out to be the case, but also knowing all of the different possibilities of what might be. At least that's what I think it means for God to be omniscient. This is a tricky issue when it comes to the question of free will. To say that God knew me in my mother's womb is to say something about God, not something about personhood and conception. As I said in a previous video, consciousness is not the soul, because there's more to a person than her conscious experiences. So maybe the self is the soul. When I think about what God knows when God knows me, I think about myself, my inmost being, how my body is made. In other words, myself includes my inner thoughts and feelings, as well as my physical features, like having blue eyes and being 5 feet tall. But none of those features appeared at conception. To see the point more clearly, think about the importance of environment in forming a healthy and sound self. From the very beginning, the fetus requires a very particular sort of environment, a womb. A pregnant woman's body is magical in its ability to stretch and move in conformity to the growing being. Attuned to these changes, a woman adjusts her daily rhythms of food and rest. The famous time-life photos of fetal development obscure the synergy of a woman and fetus by establishing the iconic image of a golden fetus in an empty black void. No human fetus yet has been born without a woman. We are all formed from the grace and labor of women. As mothers, and increasingly fathers, know well, the labor of the parent has barely begun with the birth of the child. Human infants are unique in their utter dependence on the care of others for a very long time after birth. One theory is that humans are born prematurely so our big brains can develop outside the confines of a narrow birth canal. Any woman who has delivered vaginally will agree that baby's head is quite big enough already, thank you. If big brains are needed for the survival of the species, it's good that nature hit upon a way for them to grow outside of the woman's body. If myself was not endowed at conception, who am I then? God and my mother knew me as I was knitted together in the womb. But considering the long period of care and development that's required before a child is independent, the person I now think of as myself did not come until long afterward. I vividly recall the dark days of adolescence, where I continually asked myself the question, who am I? I'm not entirely sure of the answer even now. One reason for my difficulty may be that I've been asking the wrong question. Buddhist master Sogyal Rinpoche suggests an alternative way to think about the self. Nothing has any inherent existence of its own when you really look at it. And this absence of independent existence is what we call emptiness. Think of a tree. When you think of a tree, you tend to think of a distinctly defined object. And on a certain level it is. But when you look more closely at the tree, you will see that ultimately it has no independent existence. When you contemplate it, you will find that it dissolves into an extremely subtle net of relationships that stretches across the universe. The rain that falls on its leaves, the wind that sways it, the soil that nourishes and sustains it, all the seasons and the weather, moonlight and starlight and sunlight, all form part of this tree. As you begin to think more and more about the tree, you will discover that everything in the universe helps to make the tree what it is, that it cannot at any moment be isolated from anything else, and that at every moment its nature is subtly changing. This is what we mean when we say things are empty, that they have no independent existence. Like the tree, I don't have any inherent existence. I too dissolve into a subtle net of relationships. Attention to the interconnectedness of things might help us feel less isolated and alienated as we stare at our phones, watching YouTube videos. Buddhists say that the root of suffering is the illusion that there exists a self separate from the environment and other people. My self isn't as good, rich, successful as your self, so I'm depressed, jealous, lonely. Recognizing that there is no such thing as a self, separate from everything else, releases me from the inevitable pain that comes from comparing myself to others. Even if I think myself is better than yourself, suffering still results from arrogance, pride, and derision, which well inside me like a geyser of black oil. The illusion of self is the source of suffering, so the solution is to recognize that everything is interconnected. For a Buddhist, there's no need to search for a material soul, because there's no such thing as a self, and no such thing as a soul. Yet interconnectedness alone is not enough. I may have a million Facebook friends, but no one to hold my hand when I'm ill. I may have access to endless forms of entertainment, but I'm haunted by a persistent sense of boredom and alienation. Maybe if I truly recognize the self is an illusion, that would ground me more in nature and the community rather than in the false promises of fulfillment online and in the media. Even so, I rather like the self, and I don't want to give it up. Buddhists are probably right that a release from suffering can only come from eliminating the locus of suffering, which is the self. But the self is also the locus of great joy and purpose, of love and pleasure. By eliminating sadness and pain and hatred, these other emotions are eliminated as well. Even if the end state is peace and equanimity, I would rather understand than reject the self. The first step in understanding the self is recognizing our biological and social histories described at the beginning of this video. My self was not implanted by God at conception. It developed gradually over the course of weeks of feverish genetic expression and years of nurturing within a physical and social environment. I only became a self to myself when I began to remember events from my past and to expect events in my future. This autobiographical self emerges when linguistic and cognitive development reaches a level where a person can collect the events of her life into a sort of story of herself. A child remembers going to Disneyland last year and meeting Mickey Mouse, so she decides to ask Santa for a Mickey plush toy. This ability to keep track of ourselves in time is so common and begins so early in life, at about age 3 or 4, that it may be difficult to imagine the minds of children and animals who do not have this capacity. While the exact age of the onset of episodic memory is in dispute, before this capacity develops, children live entirely in the present, unable either to reflect on the past or plan for the future. For myself, once I developed this autobiographical sense, a remarkable change took place. I began to keep track not only of the events in my life, but also my character traits and talents, and my emotional responses to things. I came to form a sense of the sort of person I am. Good at school, bad at sports, fond of ice cream. Some of these features change over time. I now like Brussels sprouts, and I used to hate them. Many are surprisingly resistant to change, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. I still have an unreasonable fear of spiders, despite years of trying to convince myself of the obvious fact that they are tiny and harmless. If my self is material and changeable, and I have only a limited power to determine its nature, I wonder again, who am I then? An immaterial soul, abstracted from the ongoing life of a self, is not a thing I can identify as me. The material soul for which I am searching is connected to this person housed in my body, my memories, my decisions, my character, and my relationships. God's power to know me as I am knitted together in the womb and beyond is testament to my changing nature as I develop and God's enduring love throughout this vexing, miraculous process. God knows and loves me as myself. The womb was just the beginning.